They believed Sabina Quill had been tested beyond her limits. For years, she transported sugar barrels, hauled damaged machinery, and bore the weight of others' unkindness without ever raising her voice. The men at Black Cypress interpreted that silence as submission. What they did not realize was that she had spent all those years cataloging every flaw in the plantation's operations. When 8 armed men finally positioned themselves between her and a man who had been marked for discipline, Sabina did not plead. She advanced. By the time that night ended, the 8 men would lie defeated. The plantation would be tracking her through the swampland, and the 9th man dispatched to retrieve her would address her by a name that none there were meant to recognize. Black Cypress occupied the fringe of the Atchafalaya Basin, where farmed fields gave way to drowned woodland, winding inlets, and mire deep enough to swallow a horse. In 1846, the estate was under the control of Ambrose Vail. Vail's prosperity was not built on efficiency by itself. It was constructed through exhaustion. Throughout the grinding season, the sugar mill operated before dawn and continued well past nightfall. The equipment was outdated, the belts were frayed, and the laborers were kept near gears strong enough to crush limbs and timber without hesitation. Halting work meant a loss of revenue. To Vail, that was a more severe consequence than losing human beings. Sabina Quill had spent nearly her whole existence at Black Cypress. At 31, she was recognized throughout the plantation for a degree of physical power that unnerved those who claimed dominion over her. She transported barrels that normally demanded 2 individuals. She pulled loaded cane carts when the animals became ineffective. She lifted broken mill components while others positioned supports underneath. The overseers exploited her strength whenever it served them. They inflicted punishment on the same strength whenever it made them feel uneasy. Sabina had discovered early that visible fury gave cruel individuals a justification. She seldom argued. She did not issue threats. When told to labor, she labored. When insulted, she observed. That stillness fostered the falsehood that shielded her. The men at Black Cypress believed she had been crushed. She had not. Over years, Sabina had scrutinized them. She knew which overseer dragged his left foot after long hours in the yard. She knew which guard consumed from a metallic flask prior to the evening shift. She knew which men first grabbed a firearm and which ones reached for cordage. She observed how long it took them to reload. She tallied how often patrols traversed the eastern boundary. She memorized the span between the living quarters and the marsh. No one commanded her to acquire this intelligence. No one suspected she had. This knowledge came from Moret Sable. Moret had once worked as a healer among the enslaved population. By the time she began instructing Sabina, age had weakened her hands but not her discernment. She perceived the plantation as a mechanism. The fields yielded the harvest. The mill processed it. Coercion kept the workforce in motion. Every element relied upon the others. Moret taught Sabina that survival required discerning which component could be induced to break down. Their sessions occurred after dark behind abandoned storage buildings or among the cypress trees beyond the washing area. Moret demonstrated how to break a hold without opposing the full power of the person restraining you. She taught her to interpret the posture of a man's shoulders before he acted. She revealed how uneven terrain could be more effective than a weapon. Yet the majority of the instruction concerned pursuit. A person fleeing Black Cypress would not be pursued by a single man. Vail would dispatch riders, hounds, vessels, and paid trackers. The roadways would be monitored first, then the river crossings, then the communities where frightened individuals might seek aid. Moret taught Sabina to go where fear would instinctively push her. A tracker is dangerous only as long as you stay on the route he anticipates. Sabina held that lesson more firmly than anything else Moret ever told her. She carried it through every punishment and each night shift. She carried it after Moret vanished. The plantation alleged that the older woman had fallen ill and perished in confinement. No corpse was displayed to Sabina. No burial was observed. At Black Cypress, absence was often offered as evidence. Sabina understood that inquiries could invite repercussions, so she voiced none openly. She continued her observations. The sole person who nearly grasped what she was doing was Jonas Pike. Jonas was 24 and functioned as a cooper. He mended barrels, reinforced shipping crates, and replaced damaged wooden parts around the mill. His role permitted him to move between the workshop and the milling floor. He observed the machinery at close range. He also noticed Sabina studying it. Several weeks prior to the conflict, Jonas saw her standing near the main press after the night shift. She was examining the large drive gear where 2 iron teeth had started to fracture. The damage was severe. If the gear gave way under complete pressure, it could project metal fragments across the mill floor. The moving rollers might continue long enough to drag workers into the equipment before anyone could halt the engine. Jonas reported the defect to an overseer. The overseer dismissed him. A second laborer alerted the mill supervisor. He was told to go back to his post. Ambrose Vale was informed before the subsequent grinding cycle commenced. He declined to sanction repairs. Replacing the gear would have halted production for multiple days. The harvest was already behind schedule, and sugar prices were favorable. Vale decided that the danger belonged to the workers. The profit belonged to him. Sabina overheard the decision from outside the workshop. She stayed silent. For 3 nights, she observed the gear deteriorating. Every rotation generated a harsher metallic clang. Every shift brought more people within range of the failing mechanism. Jonas began moving workers away from the exposed side whenever supervisors were not paying attention. It was insufficient. On the 4th morning, Sabina noticed a crack spreading across the center of the gear. The mill should have been stopped immediately. Instead, the supervisor demanded more cane be brought forward. Sabina exchanged a look with Jonas. Neither spoke. That evening, the mill completed another cycle without falling apart. The workers retreated to the quarters believing they had lived through another day. Sabina did not accompany them. She lingered near the equipment shed until the yard was empty. The main gear was shielded by a wooden casing held in place with iron pins. Sabina had watched Jonas remove those pins during maintenance. She recognized which tool he employed. She knew where he kept it. The harm she inflicted was restrained. She did not demolish the mill. She struck the weakened section in a manner that split the cracked teeth before the machine could be restarted. The noise echoed across the yard, a sharp metallic snap, then stillness. By dawn, the sugar mill was inoperable. Ambrose Vale arrived before the workers had assembled. He entered the mill, inspected the broken gear, and instantly dismissed the idea of mechanical failure. The fracture was too precise. Someone had completed what carelessness had started. Vale ordered every tool inventoried. He commanded that the quarters be searched. He ordered food withheld until the guilty party was identified. The allegation was not truly about property destruction. It was about authority. If one enslaved person could halt the mill, even to avert a catastrophe, then Vale's dominance was not absolute. That prospect terrified him more than the broken machine. The overseers started interrogating workers individually. They demanded confessions. They threatened collective retaliation. By midday, no one had admitted guilt. Sabina continued removing damaged parts from the mill as if she knew nothing. Jonas observed her from the cooper's shed. He had discovered his missing tool near the gear housing. He understood her actions. He also understood what Vale would do if he uncovered the truth. Sabina was too powerful, too perceptive, and too highly regarded among the workers. Vale would not treat the sabotage as a solitary incident. He would brand it as preparation for insurrection. Before sunset, Jonas made his choice. He walked into the yard while Ambrose Vale was interrogating the mill supervisor. Jonas confessed. He claimed he had broken the gear because Vale had refused to supply proper tools, and because the machinery had grown too dangerous to run. The first part was untrue. The second was not. Vale did not probe further. He had discovered someone to penalize. That was enough. Jonas was seized, searched, and dragged toward the central yard. A punishment post stood there next to the mill, situated so that workers could be compelled to observe. Vale ordered 8 overseers to assemble. He also dispatched a rider to summon an outside tracker who had arrived at Black Cypress earlier that week. The man's name was Lucian Rusk. Throughout Louisiana, Lucian was known for tracking down individuals who vanished into places where ordinary patrols would not venture. He knew flooded woodlands. He knew hidden crossings. He knew how frightened runaways moved when starvation started to impair their judgment. He was a black man employed to return other black people to subjugation. Vale trusted him because men like Vale believed treachery was more effective when it originated from someone the hunted might misidentify as an ally. Sabina had never encountered Lucian before, but when he entered the yard and surveyed the gathered workers, his gaze settled on her. He said nothing. Sabina noticed him anyway. She noticed the shift in his expression. Not exactly recognition, something nearer to astonishment. Jonas was bound to the post before the sun had entirely vanished. The 8 overseers created a loose perimeter around him. Some carried cudgels. 2 had pistols. 1 held a coiled length of rope. The workers were ordered into the yard. Vale needed witnesses. Public chastisement was not only intended to harm the person at the post. It was meant to instill fear in everyone observing. Sabina stood near the front. Jonas met her gaze once. He showed no hint of regret. The senior overseer raised the lash. Sabina stepped out of the assembly. She did not shout. She admitted that Jonas had confessed to an act she had performed. The overseer instructed her to go back to her position. Sabina kept walking. She positioned herself between Jonas and the 8 armed men. "He stood in my place," she stated. "Now you must go through me to get to him." For several moments, nobody moved. The men were not afraid yet. They were bewildered. They had spent years viewing Sabina as labor, as property, as a body useful only when directed by someone else. They had never considered what would occur if that body selected its own objective. Their confusion granted her the initial benefit. It would not be the final one. If you are listening from somewhere tonight, comment with your city, state, or country, and tell us what time it is where you are. Stories like this endured because people transported them beyond the places where powerful men attempted to suppress them. Let us see how far Sabina's story has spread. The first man moved before Vale gave an order. His name was Hollis Crane, one of the younger overseers, employed because he was eager to demonstrate that harshness could replace authority. He reached for Sabina's right arm with both hands. She allowed him to come near. Moret had taught her that men, who believed they were stronger, usually committed their full weight prematurely. Hollis did precisely that. Sabina rotated her shoulder, seized his wrist, and drew him past her center. He collided with the side of a cane cart, collapsing against it. The yard transformed in that moment. Before then, the overseers thought they were confronting disobedience. Afterward, they realized they were facing resistance. A second man charged from Sabina's left. She moved backward, hooked one foot beneath the loose hauling rope beside the mill, and yanked it. The rope snapped taut across his legs. He fell before he could lift his club. The other workers did not stir. They had been commanded to observe, and years of discipline had conditioned them to stay motionless even when the unthinkable occurred before them. But their quietness was no longer the quietness Vale intended. It had become a tension. The senior overseer yelled for the others to tighten the circle. That directive exposed the flaw in their arrangement. 8 armed men could overpower one woman in open terrain, but the sugar yard was not open terrain. It was cluttered with barrels, chains, carts, steam pipes, and broken machinery. Sabina knew every obstacle. The men did not. 2 approached together, one brandishing a wooden baton, the other reaching for the rope at his waist. Sabina retreated toward the damaged mill housing. They assumed she was withdrawing. She was positioning them where she wanted them. The man with the baton swung first. Sabina sidestepped. The weapon struck the iron casing, jarring his hands. Before he could recover, she drove him backward into the second man. Both tumbled against a pile of empty barrels. The barrels scattered and rolled into the yard, disrupting the men attempting to advance from behind. Vale began shouting from the edge of the scene. He commanded them to open fire. The order was reckless. Several workers stood beyond Sabina, and Jonas remained bound directly behind her. Vale knew this. He gave the order anyway. That was the extent of his control. He was prepared to endanger every person in the yard, rather than allow one act of defiance to go unpunished. One overseer drew a pistol. Lucian Rusk shifted slightly, but did not intervene. His eyes stayed fixed on Sabina. The gunman tried to find a clear shot through the chaos. Sabina observed the barrel rising. She pulled the release lever on a damaged steam pipe beside the mill wall. A burst of vapor swept across the yard. It was not enough to harm anyone, but it obscured the gunmen's view and forced the nearest men to turn their faces away. Sabina closed the distance before the vapor dissipated. She struck the gunman's wrist against the wooden frame. The pistol fell. She kicked it beneath the mill platform, where no one could retrieve it quickly. The man swung at her with his free hand. She absorbed the blow on her forearm and shoved him into the wall. He remained conscious, but the fight had drained from him. That detail mattered. Sabina was not attacking indiscriminately. She was decreasing the number of men capable of continuing. The 5th overseer came from behind. Jonas noticed him and yelled a warning. Sabina dropped low as the man lunged. His momentum carried him over her shoulder and into the punishment post. The impact shook the beam. Jonas stayed bound, unable to assist. He had confessed to safeguard Sabina. Now he could only observe her placing herself between him and the repercussions he had accepted. The senior overseer, Cullen March, finally joined the conflict. Unlike the younger men, he did not charge. He had spent years managing the yard and recognized that anger was making the others careless. He carried a short iron hook used for moving cane chains. He advanced slowly. Sabina recognized the disparity immediately. Cullen did not look at her face. He watched her feet. Maurette had cautioned her about men like him. The loud ones announced their intentions. The quiet ones waited for an error. Cullen feinted toward her left, then swung low at her knee. Sabina moved back just far enough to evade the hook. He followed with a second strike. She blocked his arm with both hands, but the force pushed her against the edge of the mill platform. For the first time, the men saw her lose balance. Vale shouted for them to take her alive. 3 of the overseers still able to stand advanced at once. That was the closest they came to ending it. One grabbed her from behind. Another reached for her legs. Cullen lifted the hook again. Sabina stopped trying to break free. Instead, She drove her weight downward. The man holding her from behind had anticipated resistance in the opposite direction. His grip faltered. Sabina stamped hard on his foot, turned within his arms, and drove him into Cullen's path. The iron hook struck the wrong man across the shoulder. He collapsed immediately. Cullen hesitated. Sabina did not. She thrust both hands into his chest and sent him backward over a low barrel. The remaining overseer attempted to seize Jonas as leverage. That shifted Sabina's focus. Until then, she had fought to create separation. Now she moved directly toward the menace. The man grabbed Jonas by the hair and pressed a knife close to his throat. The yard fell still again. Vale saw an opening. He ordered Sabina to yield. She looked at the knife, then at the man holding it. He was breathing too rapidly. His grip was unsteady. His attention kept switching between Sabina and Vale. He was not ready to kill Jonas. He was ready to threaten him. Sabina stepped forward. The overseer tightened his arm. She paused. Then Jonas acted. He drove his heel backward into the man's shin. The knife shifted away from his throat. Sabina closed the remaining distance and struck the overseer's forearm against the post. The knife dropped. She pushed him aside and tore at the rope around Jonas's wrists. The knot had been pulled tight under pressure. She could not loosen it quickly. Jonas looked past her. Another man was reaching beneath his coat. A second pistol. Sabina grabbed the loose end of the whipping rope and pulled Jonas and herself down behind the post. The shot struck the mill wall. Wood splinters flew above them. The gunman tried to reload. Sabina rose before he could finish. She seized the heavy wooden pin from the punishment post and hurled it at his hands. The pistol fell beside him. He lifted both arms and retreated. He had seen enough. 6 men were down or unable to continue. 1 had withdrawn. Cullen was struggling to stand near the barrels. Only the senior gunman remained between Sabina and the open yard. He glanced toward Lucien for assistance. Lucien did not move. That refusal carried more weight than any physical blow. Vale had brought him there because Lucien Rusk had a reputation for putting down resistance. He was meant to be the ultimate resource the plantation could call upon when ordinary brutality failed. Instead, he stood apart from the others, studying Sabina as though the fight had confirmed something he had dreaded since entering the yard. The last overseer reached for the pistol on the ground. Sabina stepped on it first. He looked at her, then at the bodies and injured men scattered around the mill. He stepped away. The confrontation had lasted mere minutes. The consequences were instant. 8 men had entered the yard believing numbers, weapons, and legal authority made the outcome inevitable. None remained in command of the scene. Sabina finished cutting Jonas free with the fallen knife. His wrists were swollen from the rope. He could barely close his hands. She pulled him upright. Around them, the workers remained silent, but several had begun moving toward the edges of the yard. They understood reinforcements would come. They also grasped that what they had witnessed could not be undone. Vale stepped backward toward the main house. His authority was still protected by law, money, and armed neighbors. But in that yard, for those few minutes, it had completely failed. Sabina turned toward Lucien. He was the only man who had not attacked her. He had also been the only one watching her before the fight began. His face was controlled, but not vacant. There was recognition in it now, not doubt. Recognition. Sabina raised the knife, but did not approach. Lucien looked at her left hand. A pale scar crossed the base of her thumb, the result of an old kitchen burn from a childhood Sabina barely remembered. His expression shifted. Then he spoke a single word. Bina. No one at Black Cypress had ever called her that. The name had belonged to a different life, before the auction yard, before the separation. before Sabina Quill became the woman standing among 8 defeated men. She lowered the knife slightly. Lucian Rusk looked at her with the face of a stranger and the memory of family. The 9th hunter had not come to Black Cypress by chance. Sabina did not respond immediately. The name reached further back than Black Cypress. It belonged to a kitchen yard she could no longer picture clearly, to a woman's hands pulling her away from a fire, to a boy older than her who had once carried her across flooded ground. Fragments. Nothing complete. Lucian saw the recognition arrive. He took one step forward. Jonas moved between them. Lucian halted. Vale had reached the veranda of the main house. He was shouting for the stable hands, ordering riders sent to the neighboring plantations, demanding every available weapon be brought into the yard. The defeated overseers were no longer the immediate threat. What came next would be organized. Lucian knew it. Sabina knew it. There was no time for reunion, explanation, or grief. Sabina pointed the knife at him. "Who told you that name?" Lucian looked toward Vale, then back at her. "Our mother." The answer did not soften Sabina. It made the threat more specific. Anyone could claim kinship in a moment of crisis. Plantation owners had used false family news to lure fugitives from hiding. Slave catchers had carried messages supposedly sent by husbands, wives, and children. The system understood that love could be weaponized as effectively as fear. Sabina demanded more. Lucian provided it. He described the scar at the base of her thumb before seeing it clearly. He named the burn that caused it. He recalled the iron cooking pot, the overturned stool, and the night their mother held Sabina's hand in cold water until morning. Then he gave the name their mother had used before they were separated. Not Quill. A different name. One Sabina had not heard spoken in more than 20 years. The knife remained raised, but her grip changed. Jonas saw it. Vale called for Lucian from the house. Lucian disregarded him. That refusal exposed the first fracture in his position. He had arrived at Black Cypress as Vale's hired tracker, but no free man ignored a planter's command so deliberately. Lucian's clothing was superior to that worn by the field laborers. He carried a pistol and a hunting knife. He was allowed to travel between plantations. None of that proved freedom. It proved utility. Sabina grasped the distinction. You work for him. Lucian did not deny it. For years, he had pursued people through southern Louisiana. He found them in cane fields, abandoned cabins, fishing camps, church lofts, and stretches of swamp where white patrols refused to enter after dark. Planters paid Vale for his services. Vale sent Lucian. The arrangement was presented as employment. It was another form of ownership. Lucian had been sold multiple times after the separation. He learned early that fleeing without knowledge of terrain led directly back to chains. He began studying the men who hunted him. Later, under Vale, that knowledge was turned outward. Vale promised freedom after 10 captures. When Lucian reached 10, the number became 20. At 20, Vale claimed expenses had to be repaid. Then came the cost of horses, weapons, food, lodging, and rewards paid to informants. The debt grew every time Lucian worked. This was not deception by accident. It was policy. The promise had never been intended for fulfillment. It existed to make obedience feel temporary. Sabina listened without sympathy. A false promise could explain Lucian's service. It could not erase what that service had done. Jonas heard movement near the stables. Men were bringing out horses. The workers at the edge of the yard began withdrawing toward the quarters. No one needed to be told what the arrival of neighboring patrols would mean. Collective punishment was likely. Interrogation was certain. Vale would try to identify anyone who had encouraged Sabina, helped damage the mill, or failed to intervene during the fight. Sabina turned to the gathered workers. She gave no speech. She told them to return to the cabins, stay separated, and repeat the same truth. The fight had happened too quickly for anyone to act. It was not a complete defense. Under slavery, innocence did not guarantee safety, but a consistent account could slow Vale's retaliation and create confusion about who knew what. Jonas looked at the road beyond the main house. They had minutes. Lucian spoke again. The eastern trail is already lost. Sabina watched him. Vale's men would expect her to use the swamp, because she had grown up near it. The eastern trail was the most direct route from Black Cypress to deeper water. Lucian said riders would reach it before she did. He knew because he had helped design the plantation's pursuit plan. Every major property in the district kept an informal map of likely escape routes. Roads were watched first, ferries second. Known free black settlements were searched or threatened. Patrols then moved inward using dogs to force fugitives toward controlled crossings. Maurette had taught Sabina how to evade hunters. Lucian had taught hunters how to close the ground. That made him useful. It also made him dangerous. Sabina asked the question she had avoided since hearing his first answer. What happened to Maurette? Lucian's face changed before he spoke. That was enough. Sabina lowered the knife, not from trust, from certainty. Lucian had known her. Maurette had escaped Black Cypress 4 years earlier. The plantation had concealed it, because Vale did not want other workers knowing an older woman had crossed the perimeter alone. She reached the western marsh. Lucian found her 2 days later. He recognized her name from stories their mother had once told about distant relatives and people separated during earlier sales. Maurette recognized him as Sabina's brother. She tried to use that truth. She told him Sabina was alive. She told him where she was. She begged him not to return her. Lucian brought her back anyway. Vale had promised that capturing the organizer of several escape attempts would settle Lucian's debt. The promise lasted until Maurette was inside the gate. Then Vale changed the terms again. Maurette was confined in an outbuilding near the river landing. She survived for several months. Vale allowed no one from the quarters to see her. The official claim of illness was false. Her isolation was punishment and interrogation. Vale wanted the names of every person she had helped. Maurette gave him none. Lucian knew because Vale ordered him to question her. Sabina stood without moving. The noise of preparation continued around them. Saddles tightened. Metal struck wood. Vale's voice carried from the veranda, but the center of the yard had become still. Maurette had trained Sabina for the day hunters came. The man standing before her had been the hunter who brought Maurette back. Jonas moved toward Lucian. Sabina stopped him with one hand. The restraint was not mercy. It was judgment delayed by necessity. Lucian did not ask for forgiveness. That would have made his confession smaller than it was. He said Maurette died without giving Vale a single name. He said her last clear words were not directed at him, but at Sabina. She had told him that if Sabina ever learned the truth, he was not to ask her for understanding. He was to give her a way out. Lucian had carried that instruction for years, while continuing to hunt others. That was the fact he could not defend. Regret had not stopped him. Fear had not stopped him. The possibility of reward had remained stronger than shame. Sabina stepped close enough that Lucian could see there was no reunion in her expression. You brought her back. Wes, you hunted people from this place. Wes, you knew I was here. Lucian hesitated. That hesitation mattered. He had known for almost a year. Vale had forbidden him from approaching her. Lucian accepted the order, because he still believed his promised release was near. He had watched Sabina from a distance on 2 earlier visits to Black Cypress. He had chosen silence. The betrayal was not confined to the past. Sabina could have ended the conversation there. Jonas wanted her to, but a horn sounded from the southern road. One long blast, then another. The first neighboring patrol had been alerted. Lucian looked toward the swamp. He told Sabina there was one route Vale's men would not block immediately. A maintenance path used by trappers and search parties to move behind fugitives already driven east. It began west of the cane sheds, crossed a drainage channel, and entered the swamp through a stand of dead cypress. No escaping worker knew it existed because the route had been built to capture them. Lucian knew every turn. Sabina made her decision. She would not forgive him. She would use him. He would lead them through the path he had used against others. He would identify the pursuit signals, the dog routes, and the places where patrols waited. If he tried to mislead them, Sabina would leave him in the swamp. Lucian accepted without protest. Jonas retrieved the fallen pistol but found it damaged. He took the knife instead. Sabina looked once toward the quarters. The workers were disappearing inside. The yard still held the evidence of Vale's failure. Broken barrels, abandoned weapons, injured overseers, and a punishment post with its rope cut open. Vale would restore order through greater violence. That was how the plantation system responded whenever its authority was exposed as fragile. Sabina, Jonas, and Lucian moved behind the mill. They crossed the equipment yard before the first riders reached the main gate. At the cane sheds, Lucian turned west. Sabina followed several steps behind him, not as a sister, not yet. She followed as a woman entering the swamp behind the man who had destroyed her mentor, and now claimed he knew the only road to freedom. The maintenance path did not resemble an escape route. That was why it worked. It began behind the cane sheds as a narrow strip of hardened ground between drainage ditches, then disappeared beneath low brush. No marker identified it. No worker from the quarters was permitted near it without supervision. Lucian had used it for years. Search parties entered through this passage after fugitives had already been pushed toward the eastern swamp. It allowed mounted men and handlers to move behind them, close the distance, and seal the deeper channels. Sabina understood the design immediately. The plantation had not simply guarded its boundaries. It had constructed the landscape around anticipated escape. Lucian led them west for several hundred yards, then cut sharply through a stand of dead cypress. Jonas followed with difficulty. His wrists were swollen, and one shoulder had been strained while he was tied to the post. Sabina watched his pace. He tried to conceal the injury. She did not ask whether he could continue. There was no alternative. Behind them, the first pursuit horns sounded from the plantation yard. A second answered from farther south. Lucian stopped and listened. The signals were part of the system he had helped create. One blast meant the fugitives had left the central property. Two indicated the direction of suspected movement. Three summoned dogs and riders from neighboring plantations. The second horn came twice. Vale believed they had gone east. Lucian had given the first false instruction before leaving the yard. He had told a stable hand that Sabina knew the eastern channels and would attempt to reach the river by the shortest route. The lie bought them minutes, not safety. Vale would realize the deception as soon as riders found no track near the eastern fence. Lucian moved faster. The path reached a drainage channel wide enough to slow them, but too shallow to block pursuit. A narrow plank bridge crossed it. Jonas stepped onto the boards. Lucian pulled him back. The bridge had been built for patrol use. One board near the center was loose. Beneath it, an iron alarm bell had been fixed to a concealed wire. Anyone crossing without lifting the board first would trigger the bell. The sound carried poorly to the plantation, but clearly through the swamp. It was not meant to warn fugitives. It warned hunters already positioned ahead. Lucian removed the board and cut the wire. Sabina watched him work. Every hidden mechanism confirmed the scale of his involvement. He had not merely followed tracks. He had helped turn the swamp into an extension of the plantation. They crossed. Sabina then pushed the loose plank into the channel. The absence would slow horses and force riders to dismount. It was the first alteration they left behind, not a false trail, a damaged system. The ground softened beyond the channel. The path narrowed between water oak and cypress knees. Lucian warned them not to step on the raised roots. Dry roots held scent longer than waterlogged mud. They moved through shallow water instead. Cold mud pulled at their feet. Jonas stumbled twice. Sabina caught him without stopping. The horns behind them changed. 3 short blasts. Vale had discovered the western route. The dogs were being released. Lucian estimated that the handlers would reach the broken bridge within 20 minutes. Sabina looked at the water. She asked how long before the dogs crossed. Lucian said less than 5 minutes after the men repaired or bypassed the gap. Sabina rejected the direct path. They left it at once. Lucian objected. The maintenance trail was faster and led to a trapper's crossing. Sabina understood the danger in speed. A known route could be predicted. Moret had warned her never to remain inside a hunter's plan, simply because the path appeared useful. Sabina moved north through deeper water. Lucian followed. It was the first time since leaving Black Cypress that he obeyed her direction. They crossed a flooded clearing where storm damage had brought down several trees. Sabina found a length of loose bark and rubbed it against Jonas's shirt and her own dress. She then tied the cloth from Jonas's torn sleeve around the bark and pushed it into the current. The water carried it east. The scent would move with it. Lucian recognized the tactic but corrected the execution. Dogs might follow waterborne scent briefly, but handlers would notice the lack of ground marks. He took the bark, added mud from the sole of his boot, and dragged it through the shallows before releasing it again. The combination created a short false line that appeared to leave the water downstream. Sabina watched without comment. His skill remained useful. That did not make it clean. The first dogs began barking in the distance. The sound was still faint, but it changed the pace. Jonas turned toward it. Lucian told him not to measure distance by volume. Water and trees distorted sound. A dog that appeared far away could already be within several hundred yards. They continued north until the flooded ground rose into a strip of firmer land. Lucian wanted to cross quickly. Sabina stopped. The higher ground would preserve every footprint. She pointed to a fallen cypress trunk, extending over the strip. They climbed onto it and moved along the wood, then stepped down into water on the opposite side. Jonas nearly lost his balance. Lucian caught him by the arm. Jonas pulled away as soon as he was stable. The movement was small, but deliberate. Lucian accepted it. None of them trusted him enough for ordinary contact. The barking grew louder. The handlers had found the western route. Sabina asked where the trail narrowed next. Lucian described a corridor of dry ground between 2 stretches of deep mud. Patrols used it because horses could pass in single file. Sabina changed direction again. They approached the corridor from the side rather than entering from the south. The mud beside it appeared shallow. Lucian said it was not. Beneath the surface lay soft peat and decayed vegetation. A horse could sink to the chest before the rider understood the ground had failed. Sabina studied the approach. The patrol would avoid that section if Lucian's old markers remained visible. 3 cuts in a low cypress trunk identified the safe path. She took Jonas's knife and removed the marked bark. Then she carved similar cuts into a tree beside the unstable ground. Lucian watched her alter the sign. You know what happens if they follow that? Sabina continued cutting. They stopped following. There was no celebration in the answer. The trap was defensive, not theatrical. The riders would be delayed, perhaps injured. But the deeper purpose was to break formation and force the handlers to control frightened animals. The dogs would lose coordination with the men. Sabina placed broken reeds across the original safe path and disturbed the mud around the false marker. The area now appeared recently crossed. They moved on. Less than 10 minutes later, shouting erupted behind them. A horse screamed once. Then came the sound of several men yelling conflicting orders. The pursuit had reached the false marker. Sabina did not look back. The delay gave them distance, but also removed any doubt that the fugitives were thinking strategically. Vale's men would become more cautious. Caution made them slower. It also made them more violent. Lucien led the group toward a disused trapping station, built on raised timber. The structure had no walls, only a roof and a floor above the water. Inside, they found an old coil of rope, a broken paddle, and 2 empty clay bottles. No food, no tools. Jonas lowered himself onto the platform. His hands had begun to shake. The fight, the restraints, and the forced pace were taking effect. Sabina examined his wrists. The skin was broken in several places, but the swelling remained the greater problem. Lucien removed a strip of cloth from inside his coat. Jonas refused it. Sabina took it and wrapped the wrists herself. They rested for less than 3 minutes. Lucien explained the next section. Ahead lay a narrow waterway used by trappers. A small flat boat was usually tied beneath an abandoned landing. If it remained there, they could reach the deeper basin before dawn. If Vale's men reached the landing first, the route would close. Sabina asked how they would know. Lucien said the hunters used an old chapel bell to signal control of the northern channels. 1 strike meant the landing was clear. 2 meant blocked. Repeated ringing meant fugitives had been sighted. The chapel had been abandoned after a flood shifted the settlement road. Its bell remained because patrols found it useful. Again, the machinery of religion had been left behind and absorbed into the machinery of capture. They left the trapping station. The barking was farther away now, disrupted by the horse incident. But another sound came from the north, a single bell strike. Lucien stopped. The landing was clear. They had a route forward. Then the bell struck again, 2 slow notes blocked. Someone had reached the northern channel ahead of them. Lucien looked toward Sabina. Vale had anticipated the trappers crossing sooner than expected. The maintenance path was no longer an advantage. It had become a funnel. Sabina listened as the bell sounded a 3rd time, then a 4th. Not the patrol signal. Someone was ringing continuously. Jonas understood first. The bell was being used to draw every search party toward the chapel. Sabina turned toward the sound. Lucien warned that the chapel might be bait. Sabina said nothing. She was already moving. For the first time that night, the hunters were not the only ones using their signals. Someone else inside the swamp had entered the pursuit. The bell continued without rhythm. That ruled out the patrols. Their signals were controlled because control was the purpose. 1 strike meant a clear route. 2 meant closure. Repeated ringing meant contact. This was different. Someone was pulling the rope hard enough to make the bell strike against itself, using noise not to communicate precision, but to create confusion. Sabina moved toward the chapel. Lucien caught up beside her. He warned that the sound would pull hunters from every direction. The dogs would turn north. Boat crews would abandon the outer channels. Riders would move toward the old settlement road. That was exactly why Sabina continued. The bell was creating a temporary void elsewhere. The question was whether the person ringing it understood what they had started. The chapel stood on a raised patch of earth between 2 flooded channels. Its roof had partially collapsed. One wall leaned outward, and the doorway no longer held a door. The bell hung from a wooden frame beside the building. A woman stood beneath it, pulling the rope with both hands. She was in her 40s, dressed in dark work clothes, soaked to the knees. A narrow skiff waited behind the chapel. Lucian recognized her. Her name was Ruthie Cade, a free black fisherwoman who carried goods between remote settlements and hunting camps. She had also carried messages for people trying to disappear. Lucian had questioned her twice in previous years. He had never proved anything. Ruthie saw him and reached for a small firearm at her waist. Sabina stepped between them. There was no time for explanation. Ruthie said the northern landing had been occupied less than half an hour earlier. 4 patrolmen had arrived by boat and positioned themselves along the channel. She had watched them from the reeds. Then she saw a second group moving south with dogs. The routes were closing. Ringing the bell was the only way to force both groups to abandon their positions. It worked. The boat patrol left 2 men behind and sent the others toward the chapel. The dog handlers changed direction. Ruthie had created a gap. It would last minutes. Jonas reached the chapel and leaned against the wall. His injured shoulder had stiffened. His wrapped hands were losing strength. Ruthie looked at him once and understood that he could not continue through waist-deep water for much longer. She pointed toward the skiff. It could carry 3 safely. There were 4 of them. Lucian said he would remain behind. Sabina rejected the offer immediately. It sounded too clean. A man who had spent years hunting others could not erase that history by volunteering for one dramatic sacrifice. More importantly, she still needed his knowledge. The patrols had reorganized faster than expected. Someone was giving Vale accurate information about the swamp routes. Sabina believed that person was not Vale. Vale owned land and men, but he did not understand the basin well enough to anticipate the trapper's landing, the maintenance path, and the northern channel within the same hour. Lucian agreed. There was another tracker involved. He named Sylvan March. March was a white contractor from St. Martin Parish who specialized in blocking river exits rather than following trails. He did not chase people directly. He predicted where exhaustion would force them to emerge. Lucian had worked beside him before. March would not be drawn completely by the bell. He would leave men in place. The gap at the landing might already be closing. Ruthie cut the bell rope. The final strike carried across the water. Then they moved. Jonas and Sabina entered the skiff. Ruthie took the stern paddle. Lucian stepped into the shallow water and held the side until they cleared the mud. He would follow along the bank and rejoin them at the broken ferry platform half a mile north. Sabina watched him disappear through the reeds. She did not know whether he intended to meet them. Trust was not required. Verification was. The skiff entered a narrow channel screened by hanging branches. Ruthie paddled without lifting the blade high enough to catch moonlight. The chapel vanished behind them. Within minutes, voices reached the water. The first search party had arrived. Men shouted at one another near the bell frame. One accused another group of sending the false signal. Another demanded the boat patrol return to the landing. Confusion had entered the pursuit, but confusion did not stop it. A gunshot sounded behind them. Ruthie did not turn. The channel narrowed until branches scraped both sides of the skiff. Jonas shifted his weight and nearly tipped the boat. Sabina caught him. His face had gone pale. He admitted that the rope at the punishment post had damaged more than his wrists. One of the overseers had twisted his arm behind the beam while securing him. He could no longer raise it. The injury changed their options. Jonas would not be able to swim if the boat overturned. He could not climb quickly. He could barely defend himself. For the first time since leaving Black Cypress, Sabina faced a limitation that strength could not solve. She had to slow down for him. The hunters understood that fugitives often became vulnerable because they refused to leave the injured behind. Men like Sylvan March built entire strategies around that fact. They called it weakness. The accusation exposed the moral emptiness of the system pursuing them. Care was treated as a defect because cruelty had no use for it. Ruthie guided the skiff beneath a low cypress branch and stopped. Ahead, faint lantern light crossed the channel. 2 men stood near the northern landing. March had left them behind. The false bell had pulled away only half the patrol. 1 man held a musket. The other controlled a narrow boat tied across the water, positioned to block passage. Ruthie whispered that turning back would place them directly in the path of the dog handlers. The banks were too soft to cross quickly. Sabina studied the landing. The patrolmen were watching the main channel. They expected a boat. They were not watching the structure beneath them. The landing had been built on tall wooden supports. Floodwater moved below the platform through a gap between the pilings. The space was narrow, too low for a person to sit upright, but wide enough for the skiff if they lowered themselves flat. Ruthie said the current would push them against the supports. The noise could expose them. Sabina removed the rope from the bow and tied it around one of the forward ribs of the skiff. She slipped into the water. Jonas tried to stop her. She ignored him. The channel reached her chest. She kept one hand on the rope and moved along the bank, using the roots to control the boat's angle. Ruthie and Jonas lowered themselves inside. The skiff drifted toward the platform. Above them, the patrolmen discussed the bell. One believed Lucian had betrayed Vale. The other said Lucian had been ordered to kill Sabina before she reached the river. Sabina heard the words from beneath the landing. She did not react, not yet. The current pressed the boat toward the first support. Sabina braced her foot against a submerged root and pulled the boat sideways. The skiff passed within inches of the timber. A patrolman stepped across the boards overhead. Mud fell through the gaps. The boat continued beneath him. At the far side, the stern struck a piling. The sound was small. It was enough. The man with the musket stopped speaking. Sabina pulled hard. The skiff cleared the platform. The patrolman leaned over the edge. He saw movement in the water. Before he could raise the alarm, a separate noise came from the trees behind the landing. A branch broke. Then Lucian stepped into view on the opposite bank. He did not attack. He ran. Both patrolmen turned toward him. Lucian drew them away from the channel, moving through visible ground where they could follow. The musket fired. The shot missed. Sabina pulled herself back into the skiff as Ruthie pushed them into deeper water. Jonas looked behind them. Lucian had not reached the ferry platform. He had used himself as the false trail. Ruthie paddled north. They covered several hundred yards before stopping beneath heavy branches. Lucian emerged from the water beside them 10 minutes later. He had circled through a drainage cut after drawing the patrolman inland. One sleeve was torn. Blood marked the upper arm, but the wound appeared shallow. Sabina said nothing about the risk he had taken. Instead, she repeated what she had heard beneath the landing. Vale had ordered Lucian to kill her before she reached the river. Jonas looked at him. Ruthie tightened her grip on the paddle. Lucian did not deny it. The silence that followed was different from the silence in the plantation yard. Their silence had hidden resistance. Here, it exposed a secret that could no longer remain buried. Sabina had believed Lucian's betrayal began with Moret and continued through years of hunting fugitives. She now understood it had been directed toward her as well. He had not entered Black Cypress only as Vale's tracker. He had arrived carrying an order for her death. Lucian remained beside the skiff with both hands visible. Ruthie kept the paddle ready as a weapon. Jonas held the knife despite the weakness in his injured arm. Sabina did not raise her voice. Why? Lucian looked toward the channel behind them before answering. Vale had not feared the fight in the yard alone. He had feared what Sabina might reveal if she reached anyone beyond his control. For years, Vale had concealed the circumstances under which Sabina and her mother entered Black Cypress. The official story was simple. Her mother had been purchased legally from a trader. Sabina had then been born into slavery on Vale's property. It was false. Their mother had been free. Her name was Amel Duroc. She had lived near New Orleans and earned money preparing food for river crews. During a journey north, she was seized with several other free black travelers by men working through an illegal trafficking network. The kidnappers destroyed what they could not use, changed names, and moved their captives inland before relatives could trace them. Vale acquired Amel through an intermediary. He later discovered enough of the truth to understand that holding her was unlawful even under the laws that protected slavery. He kept her anyway. The distinction mattered only when it threatened him. Sabina listened without interruption. Lucian said Amel spoke repeatedly of her free status after she arrived at Black Cypress. She named people who could verify it. She described where she had lived and where her freedom had been recognized. Vale isolated her. He punished anyone who repeated her claims. Then he separated her children. Lucian was sold first. Sabina remained because she was young and because Vale believed distance would erase what she remembered. It nearly did. The crime was not a misunderstanding created by poor records. It was deliberate captivity maintained after the truth was known. Vale's wealth did not depend only on a violent legal system. It also depended on violating even that system whenever profit required it. Lucian had learned the full story years later. While questioning Maurette, he heard the details Amel had passed to her before the separation. Maurette knew the names of 2 free families who had once searched for Amel. She also knew that Sabina's birth followed the kidnapping. If Amel had been free, Sabina had been born free. Vale could not allow that claim to reach a court, a church network, or a free black community with enough witnesses to support it. Lucian's final assignment was designed to prevent that possibility. He had been ordered to help recapture Sabina if he could. If capture became unlikely, he was to kill her in the swamp and report that she drowned while resisting. Vale preferred a body that could not speak. Sabina stepped out of the skiff. The water reached her waist. She moved toward Lucian until only a few feet separated them. He did not retreat. You accept it. It was not a question. Lucian said yes. Before entering the yard, he had intended to obey. Vale had promised that Sabina's death would settle every remaining debt and grant Lucian written freedom. The promise was worthless. Lucian knew Vale had lied before. He accepted it anyway because hope, when controlled by the person causing the suffering, can become another instrument of obedience. That explained the choice. It did not excuse it. Sabina's hand closed around Lucian's collar. She pulled him close. Jonas shifted forward, unsure whether to stop her or help. Lucian did nothing. Sabina could have pushed him under the water. No one there would have defended him. Instead, she released him. You do not get forgiveness because you changed your mind late. Lucian nodded. I know. The answer angered her more than a denial might have. There was no argument to strike against, no lie to expose. Only a man who had already judged himself and still remained responsible for what he had done. Ruthie ended the exchange. Lanterns had appeared to the south. More than one boat was entering the channel. They had to move. The skiff could no longer carry all 4 through open water without losing speed. Lucian proposed cutting north on foot, while Ruthie took Sabina and Jonas toward the river crossing. Sabina refused to separate. Sylvan March would expect it. An injured fugitive would be placed in the boat. The stronger person would attempt to draw pursuit away. March would position men along both routes. Lucian agreed. March had used that method before. Sabina studied the water and the pattern of lanterns. 2 boats were moving north. A third remained farther back. That vessel carried March. He allowed others to pursue while he waited near the exit. The immediate danger was not behind them. It was ahead. Ruthie knew of an older channel that curved west and rejoined the river near a collapsed ferry structure. It was slower and partially blocked by storm debris, but patrol boats could not pass through it easily. They entered the side channel. Lucian and Sabina moved in the water beside the skiff to reduce the load. Ruthie paddled. Jonas remained low inside. The passage narrowed until fallen branches formed a barrier. Sabina climbed onto the first trunk and began breaking smaller limbs. Lucian worked from the opposite side. They did not speak. For several minutes, brother and sister cleared the road together, using the same physical coordination they had once used as children, without remembering it consciously. The resemblance was visible in the work. Both tested weight before shifting it. Both favored the left hand when gripping wet wood. Both paused at the same moments to listen. Blood relation had survived separation. Trust had not. The skiff passed through. Behind them, the first patrol boat reached the blocked entrance. Men shouted for axes. The barrier would delay them briefly. Sabina asked Lucian where March would wait. He described a narrow river crossing marked by 2 dead trees and the remains of an old ferry platform. The current forced small boats close to the eastern bank. March would place shooters there. Ruthie confirmed it. The free settlement lay less than a mile beyond that crossing. Freedom was close enough to explain the concentration of force. Jonas sat upright. He asked whether there was another route. There was not one that he could survive before daylight. The confrontation could no longer be avoided. They approached the ferry crossing from the western side. Ruthie concealed the skiff beneath brush, while Sabina and Lucian moved forward. They saw Vale's men first. 6 stood near the old platform. Sylvan March was among them. He was not dressed like an overseer. He wore a plain coat, high boots, and no visible insignia. His authority came from the men around him, and the fact that he understood exactly where the fugitives would appear. Vale stood beside him. He had left Black Cypress and joined the pursuit personally. That decision exposed how much Sabina's survival threatened him. Vale was not there to recover property. He was there to destroy testimony. Lucian whispered that Vale would attempt negotiation before violence. He needed Sabina close enough to control the scene and prevent her body from being lost in the river. Vale called into the darkness. He offered Jonas medical treatment. He offered Ruthie immunity. He promised Lucian immediate freedom. Then he addressed Sabina. He said her mother had lied. The denial came too quickly. Sabina had not yet accused him aloud. Vale had answered a charge before it was spoken. That reaction confirmed what Lucian had revealed. Sabina stepped into view. March raised one hand, keeping the others from firing. Vale told her to return quietly. Sabina asked why a planter had brought 6 armed men into the swamp to recover 1 injured cooper and 1 woman. Vale said order required an example. Sabina answered that fear required silence. Vale's expression changed. The accusation had reached its target. Lucian stepped beside her. Vale looked at him and repeated the promise of freedom. This time Lucian did not react. Vale then revealed the true terms. Lucian's freedom had never depended on the number of captures. It depended on obedience without end. A tracker who knew too much about illegal sales. hidden killings, and falsified identities could not safely be released. Vale said it plainly, because he believed Lucian had nowhere else to go. The statement completed what years of broken promises had begun. Lucian finally understood that the agreement had never contained an exit. March ordered the men to advance. Lucian looked toward the concealed skiff, then toward the narrow crossing behind Vale. There was one path through. Someone had to keep the armed men facing west while Sabina, Jonas, and Ruthie moved east. Lucian handed Sabina his pistol. He told her the weapon held one shot. Then he stepped away from the water and walked toward Vale. Sabina caught his arm. He looked at her. There was no request for forgiveness in his face. Only a decision made too late to repair the past, but not too late to alter what happened next. "You lead them out," he said. Sabina released him. Lucian moved onto the broken ferry platform. March's men turned toward him, behind the brush. Ruthie pushed the skiff into the current. The crossing opened for only a few seconds. Lucian had spent years delivering people back into captivity. Now he placed himself between the hunters and the sister he had once agreed to kill. The correction did not erase the crime. It only proved that at the final moment, he understood which side of it he had chosen. Lucian walked into the open before Vale's men understood what he intended. For years, those men had known him as an instrument of pursuit. He had entered swamps ahead of them, found paths they could not read, and returned with people they had failed to capture. They expected obedience because obedience had defined his value. That expectation delayed them. Lucian reached the broken ferry platform and fired the single shot Sabina had not taken from him. He did not aim at Vale. He struck the lantern hanging from the nearest post. Darkness covered the crossing. The men reacted badly. One fired toward the sound. Another shouted that Lucian had turned. March ordered them to hold position, but the command came too late. Vale's men were no longer facing the river. They were facing one another's confusion. Ruthie pushed the skiff into the current. Sabina kept one hand on Jonas and the other on the pistol Lucian had given her. The weapon was empty now. It remained useful only as a threat. Behind them, Lucian moved across the platform, forcing March's men to shift away from the eastern bank. He knew how they had been trained. He had helped train some of them. He called false directions into the darkness. He named positions that did not exist. He shouted that Sabina was moving south. 2 men followed the lie. A third stepped off the platform into deep water and lost his weapon. Lucian was using the architecture of the pursuit against itself one final time. The skiff entered the narrow current near the eastern bank. March saw it. He ignored Lucian and raised his musket toward Sabina. Vale shouted for him not to fire. The order did not come from mercy. Vale still wanted control of Sabina's body and of the story her survival might carry. That hesitation saved her. Ruthie drove the paddle into the water. Sabina turned and aimed the empty pistol at March. He could not know it had already been fired. He lowered his musket behind the rail. For several seconds, neither weapon discharged. Then the current carried the skiff beyond the platform. The crossing was open. Lucian remained behind. Gunfire followed. The first shot came from March's position. The second came from farther inland. Then several weapons discharged almost together, impossible to separate by source. Sabina turned toward the sound. Jonas caught her wrist. Returning would not save Lucian. It would only deliver all 3 of them back to Vale. The skiff continued east. The shots stopped before the ferry platform disappeared from view. There was no final cry. No confirmed death. Only silence. That absence would remain with Sabina longer than any certainty could have. Ruthie guided the boat through a narrow break, in the reeds and into a wider channel connected to the river. They did not speak until the lanterns behind them were no longer visible. Jonas's condition worsened. His injured arm had swollen from shoulder to wrist. His breathing had become shallow, and the strain of staying upright threatened to send him into the water. Sabina held him against the side of the skiff while Ruthie paddled. The escape did not end when the guns disappeared. People fleeing slavery were often most vulnerable after the immediate pursuit failed. Exhaustion, infection, hunger, and exposure accomplished what patrols could not. The system relied on distance itself as a weapon. Ruthie took them to a settlement hidden beyond a line of low trees near the river. The community was small. Most of its residents were free black fishermen, laborers, boat repairers, and families who lived under constant pressure from patrols and kidnappers. They did not ask Sabina for proof before helping her. They moved Jonas into a cabin and treated his shoulder. The joint had been partially displaced and the bindings at the punishment post had damaged the muscles around it. He survived. He never recovered full strength in that arm. For a cooper, the injury carried a lasting cost. He could still repair barrels and shape wood, but heavy work became slower. Each movement preserved the consequence of the punishment Vale had ordered and Sabina had interrupted. Sabina remained hidden for several weeks. During that time, word reached the settlement through river workers that Vale had returned to Black Cypress with several injured men. No one could confirm what happened to Lucian. One account claimed he died at the ferry platform. Another said March captured him alive. A third insisted Lucian escaped after leading the search party into the flooded timber north of the crossing. Vale offered no public explanation. That silence was deliberate. If Lucian had died protecting Sabina, Vale had no reason to let the story spread. If Lucian survived, Vale had even more reason to conceal it. Men who depend on fear rarely admit that one of their own instruments turned against them. Sabina wanted to return for answers. Ruthie stopped her. There was no safe way back and no answer waiting there that could change what had already happened. Lucian had betrayed Moret. He had hunted people who trusted the wrong path. He had accepted an order to kill his own sister. Then, at the crossing, he had chosen to stand between her and the men he once served. Both truths remained. The second did not erase the first. The first did not make the second meaningless. That was the burden Sabina carried forward. The larger problem remained her legal status. Lucian's confession gave her a history, but not proof. No surviving document was available. No recognized witness could be produced immediately. The families who had once searched for Emil Durek had scattered, died, or moved beyond reach. Vale had controlled the passage of time. That was one of the system's most effective weapons. A stolen person could be made legally invisible if enough years passed, enough names changed, and enough witnesses disappeared. Sabina had been born free. She could not prove it in a court built to doubt her and protect Vale. The contradiction exposed the fraud at the center of the law. Freedom could exist as a fact and still be denied without evidence controlled by the very people who benefited from its destruction. Sabina, therefore, took another name. She did not seek a public trial. She survived first. Jonas remained with her. They moved between river settlements, never staying long enough for questions to gather. Jonas repaired boats, crates, and barrels. Sabina worked where she could, but her real value was soon recognized elsewhere. She understood pursuit. She knew how patrols divided terrain, how dogs were used, how bridges were watched, and where frightened people were expected to emerge. Some of that knowledge came from Moret. Some came from Lucian. Sabina turned both against the system that created them. Over the following years, she guided escaping men and women through the same channels that had nearly trapped her. She avoided the obvious roads. She used floodwater to break scent. She redirected patrols with false signals. She taught people to listen for bells, horns, and changes in dogs' movement. She did not promise that everyone would survive. She promised only that the hunters would not receive an easy path. Jonas built hidden compartments into supply boats and reinforced damaged skiffs used for night crossings. Together, they helped create a route through the basin that planters could not fully control. The route had no official name. That was intentional. Names could be repeated under interrogation. Maps could be seized. The safest network existed through memory, timing, and trust. Sabina never told the people she guided that Lucian Rusk had been her brother. His name still carried fear in communities across southern Louisiana. Some remembered relatives he had captured. Others remembered hearing his dogs or seeing him beside armed patrols. Sabina did not ask those people to reconsider him. His final act belonged to her memory. His earlier acts belonged to those who suffered from them. When someone asked why she understood hunters so well, she gave the same answer. The man who taught me how hunters think was once the best among them. Nothing more. Black Cypress continued operating after the damaged gear was repaired. Vale replaced injured overseers. He tightened patrols. He punished workers he suspected of helping Sabina, though he could never prove who had known her plan. The plantation survived because institutions built on exploitation rarely collapse after one defeat. But it changed. Workers carried the story of the sugar yard beyond Vale's control. 8 armed men had failed to hold one woman. A tracker had turned against the planter who controlled him. A punishment intended to restore fear had produced an escape route. That was the consequence Vale could not reverse. Sabina did not become free because the law recognized what had been done to her. She became free because she escaped the men who had falsified her life and then helped others do the same. It was not justice. Justice would have restored her mother's name, exposed the kidnapping network, punished Vale, and accounted for every person Lucian had returned to bondage. None of that happened. What remained was resistance without legal recognition, survival without public vindication, and redemption without forgiveness. Those are not clean endings. History rarely offers clean endings to people denied control over the record. Sabina Quill disappeared from any traceable account under the name Vale had used for her. But along the waterways beyond Black Cypress, stories persisted about a powerful woman who guided fugitives through channels even professional trackers refused to enter. Some said she could hear pursuit before the dogs began barking. Others said she knew every false crossing in the basin because the man who built them had died to open one for her. Whether Lucian died at the ferry, escaped into the swamp, or was captured and silenced remains unresolved. That uncertainty is where the story leaves its final accusation. A system that destroyed identities also destroyed conclusions. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and turn on notifications so more accounts of resistance, betrayal, and survival can be carried. Comment with your city, state, or country and tell us where you are listening from tonight. Then share your theory. Did Lucian die at the ferry crossing? Did he escape after drawing the hunters away? Or did Ambrose Vale hide the truth because Lucian survived long enough to expose him? Somewhere between those possibilities is the ending Vale never wanted anyone to question.